Voilà, je vais demander à Fabrice le Saché, le vice-président, porte-parole du MEDEF, vice-président de la commission PME.
Let me ask.
Me rejoindre. Carine Kraus, la directrice exécutive de l'entreprise.
So let me ask the executive director of engagement for Carrefour. We have Monique, Barbut, president of WNF France, Étienne Barel, deputy director general of the FBF, and of course we are also very happy, very honoured, very pleased to welcome by a video link as well the Secretary of State at the German Chancellery, Jörg, Kukies, in addition to Fabrice Saché, Vice President and Spokesperson for the MEDEF. So to you, Jörg, Kukies, thank you very much for being here. I was mentioning earlier the huge sums of money. What is your opinion on the need for financing and the role of banks? We heard from the economist from Copenhagen Economics a moment ago who said that public funding is not necessary a requirement. What is your opinion from Germany on how these transitions can be financed?
Hello, can you hear me and see me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, very good. Yes, many thanks for inviting me, and of course it's a very timely question that you are asking. We were yesterday in Esbjerg, in one of the wind capitals of the world, with the prime ministers of Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and the Commission president to discuss exactly this with the European industry engaged in offshore wind generation and distribution, and the sums are quite staggering. Germany alone will electrify its economy with a massive shift both to electricity generation, but of course also renewables. 80% of our electricity will be produced from renewables by 2030. We will go from currently 500 to 600 terawatt hours per year to 800 in 5 to 6 years, and 1,600 or more at the end of the 2030s. So reinforcing the grid, building the capacity is something that will need billions and billions in financing. And the consensus yesterday at the North Sea Wind Summit with with the 4 prime ministers and the Commission president was exactly as you quoted before. The bulk of that financing will be done by the private sector. That was consensus both between the CEOs who were present and the heads of government. So in that sense, I think it's exactly now the question how and who in the private sector will provide that financing. Because of course this question of build out that I just mentioned for offshore wind will continue in many other areas, for onshore, for photovoltaics, for then thinking about storage in terms of batteries, green hydrogen, and many of these elements. So this is something that, of course, in Germany we will push forward massively in our quest to become climate neutral by 2045. And of course, the task of undoing what we did for 250 years in terms of consumption of fossil energy needing to be revised in 25 years is a quite awesome task. And of course, the other big topic that has come up over the past few months due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that we are not only linearly going from fossil fuel consumption to renewables, but we're also sidestepping and doing an interim step of fossil Russian fuels to fossil non-Russian fuels. Because, of course, we've politically decided whether we succeed with sanctions regime at the European level or not, to exit the consumption of Russian coal, oil, and gas. Coal were already going out and will be finally done by August, oil by the end of the year, and gas, of course, a much more complicated question, but the target is also to go down to zero by 2024. So all of that, of course, will require quite a large amount of infrastructure build. It will require some infrastructure build in fossils. President von der Leyen mentioned that in Repower EU yesterday, although it seems counterintuitive to the Green Deal. Things like the TAL pipeline will have to be reinforced. We will have to build LNG terminals in massive scale. We'll have to build pipelines. The positive news is all of this infrastructure build to replace Russian gas.
Est-ce que je peux me permettre
Apologies, Secretary of State. Allow me to interrupt you just for a moment to ask you another question. You were talking obviously about renewable energies, and we know just how important they are in the economic transition. You were talking about wind energy. We have a major project to develop offshore wind here in France, but you haven't mentioned photovoltaics. You could also talk about wave energy, or also nuclear. In France, nuclear is still a major source, even though it's falling. Is nuclear completely out of the picture for the economic transition from your perspective?
Well, Germany, as you know, has taken a different path than our friends and colleagues in France. The amount of nuclear power generating capacity that we have left is only 4.3 gigawatts. That is a small fraction of our installed capacity. The political consensus is to exit. And from the expertise that we have now out of the ministries responsible, extending the life of the 3 nuclear reactors that we still have online would be quite costly and very intensive. And then, of course, there's the question of levelized cost of energy, where a lot of our experts and companies are telling us that even in countries that are have a very pro-nuclear legal infrastructure and public consensus, the cost of producing nuclear is actually vastly higher than the cost of producing renewable energy through wind, solar, and other means. So in that sense, we are more in the camp of diversifying sources. Of course, the question of capacity when the wind is not blowing and the sun isn't shining is a key one. Hence the question of storage. But there will be different approaches on this.
Alors, j'aimerais qu'on donne la parole aussi à nos invités.
Thank you very much. I would please stay online with us, Secretary of State. I'll move now to our other speakers. We have heard a lot about the crisis. We have a representative here from the Carrefour group. Before we hear from the WWF, from Monique Barbut on behalf of the WWF, how are you preparing companies? We don't just have large businesses.
Vous challengez un peu, mais comment le MEDEF prépare?
So how is the MEDEF preparing its members to this transition and to what is happening? Well, first of all, the transitions that you mentioned, the energy and environmental transitions are a question of innovation and obviously of financing. So what does this mean? Well, you need access to finance. And in order to have access to finance, well, these costs have to be competitive. Why? Because there is a global competition. This is happening. A subject that we are interested in is looking at the short, medium and long term. During the presidential campaign, there was a lot of talk about moving to a zero carbon policy. France is reducing its carbon used by 2% every year. It's not enough, of course, but we're doing very, very well compared to others. How do we do better? Really, this is the question. We have tried to look at this objectively. We commissioned a report from Rexkov, and MEDEF was involved in this. This was submitted to the French authorities a few days ago, and the report is very clear. If we want to reach carbon neutrality, we will need to have an investment chunk of 3 to 40 billion euros per year, in addition to a business as usual scenario. That is for businesses and companies. For individuals, it's 20% higher than that. And obviously for private individuals, for households, they can do this. They can reduce their operating costs by insulating their houses, double glazing, and so on. It's not quite the same for business. And so, how do we go about it? Well, we have some thoughts about, some ideas. We could reinvent the wheel. We could reduce. We could cut taxes. And this would match, in fact, the increase that is required to make up loss. And in terms of banking, there are a few things. Firstly, we must avoid a banking collapse. We must avoid more banks collapsing. When banks go bankrupt, this is an issue for the real economy. It's a problem for companies. And the fact that there is regulation, if it is reasonable, if it is proportionate, and if it is arrived at in agreement with the industry, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But now, if you are evicting things from the real economy by over-evaluating, over-assessing, or overstating the risk, and this, I think, can be stated with reference to today, Basel III. I know that there are lots of experts here, but Basel III has been structured on some aspects according to we could say, North American model. And so downstream, there are issues with the credit market, the housing loan, the mortgage market. The way we look at the solvability of individuals is rather different. And so if we don't distinguish between how we do this here and in the US, where you have this eviction rate of what is going on in the US, and you're less likely to get a loan. And 60% of countries are not rated. So here means bad rated when you don't have a rating at all. These small SMEs and very small companies, they need access to finance. We talk a lot about the trade deficits, and this impacts exports. There are real issues, the technical issues, these so-called bad debts that are underwritten by public or private entities have to be taken into account and have to be included in this prudential ratio, basically saying that we have to have more capital in reserve, which again means less money to finance and going to companies. And so basically the underlying philosophy of taking capital away and draining it towards low carbon solutions, it's a good idea in principle, but there's this issue of best in class, and what we're actually going to do is focus all of the funding on the best solution. So if we look at this clearly, we don't really have the answer yet, and if we work closely with the banking sector to advocate for different ideas that may not be exactly the same, but are very, very similar in many, many ways. I think this is really interesting. Let's hear from the Carrefour group. You previously, I think, were working for Veolia. And these are topics that you are very, very familiar with. Tell us about how Carrefour, this major distribution consumer goods company, how are you thinking about this green transition?
Bonjour.
Yes, good morning. Well, how are we approaching this? Well, we're trying to identify the different impacts of this transition, how we are going to be impacted. This sometimes requires financing, but sometimes we actually also create value. We create customers and so on. And so the first impact, I think, is on our products. We are distributors, and we sell products that are impacted by the green transition. I'm sure you've all seen the organic. We're leaders in organic. Also, plant proteins. That is another area where we are quite strong. This is part of the green transition where we're very strong. If you can anticipate the trends, you can put yourself in a strong position and create value. Obviously, there's also an issue for our employees. We were talking also about the digital revolution. We have 300,000 employees, and we're going to be training all of our staff in the digital transition, 100,000 every year over a period of 3 years. And this green revolution for us, I mean, obviously we have to explain this to our customers as well. Act for Food is the name of our program. What it means for us, if we are able to put in place a more virtuous eating habits, if you like, to everybody, this is what it means for us. So we've looked at the products, the employees, and also the stores, sort of our infrastructure compared to other businesses, if you like. And so we are facing the same issues. Perhaps the carbon neutrality and biodiversity, of course, is very important to us. And we will be very neutral in terms of e-commerce as well, logistics, data centers. That is also produces a lot of greenhouse gases in other areas as well. So all of these things, I mean, that this is going to totally change, the green revolution is going to totally change the way we do business, the way we go about things, including our discussions with banks. Now we talk about full CSR, corporate social responsibility, and it changes actually all aspects of governance and how we operate. We need to change the way that we address others. I am a director of engagement. This is a new creation. We also have a chief impact officer. Sorry, it's the same role as the chief impact officer, as we say. And this is about diversity, inclusion, solidarity, the employer brand, because recruitment is also an issue. So engagement is really about taking position. So actually you are recruiting at the moment, and you are recruiting in the metaverse. With Alexandre Bompard is fully behind this. So a question for you now, before we hear from Monique, Barbut, who we're very, very pleased to have with us on behalf of the WEF. So you have, like any company, you have staff who have been with you, who have a certain age, and others who are younger, others who are older. So what happens with the younger employees? I'm not trying to stigmatize them in any way, but those who are younger than me, are they more sensitive to the green transition and also better at the digital transition as well than the older ones, for instance, those, say, my age? Well, we do not believe that this is the case. This is perhaps a little bit of a visible phenomenon, but I think also the older employees are sometimes affected by the perspective of their children, who can sometimes be more aware. And so we have these superheroes, this ambassador system for those who are really, really involved and committed to CSR issues across the group. And this is something that we've created. And governance tools, I think lots of things are changing. The way that we are financing ourselves is also changing. We are finding green finance. In fact, this is we have created a sustainability-linked bond for the first time, and it worked really well. That was launched in March. Several billion euros raised in this way, and recycling plastics in store. If we don't achieve our indicators, the yields will be lower. So there is an element of risk attached to it. Now, a lot of our executive teams are linked to have their pay linked to this. So there's real motivation behind it. But obviously, we have to work with other stakeholders as well. Monique, Barbut, I am very interested, of course, in hearing the voice of the MEDEF. I've heard from them and also from companies, the impact head of impact at Carrefour. So I'm now interested, Monique, in your view. How do you feel? What is your reaction when you hear, obviously, companies tell us about their plans? And then we will look at how other companies are reacting from Étienne Barel. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Obviously, Carrefour is one example. They are very close to being the best in class on many of these issues. It is true. But I myself am extremely attuned to the fact that economic activity in France is not limited to very, very large corporates, large companies. And we have to consider how the entirety of the French economy is going to be impacted by these issues. I must say that I'm a little bit troubled by your way of presenting things, namely by saying the environmental transition represents a cost. It is not a cost. I'm sorry. It is an investment. It's, for instance, the drought that we are headed for this year. If you look at the cost of flooding, for instance, as it can clearly be seen by a number of insurers, for instance, this is directly linked to climate change. And working on the green transition, the ecological transition, actually represents an investment and economic opportunity. Why is it that we say today that the energy transition is going to be financed via the private sector, via banks? Well, the reason is because, yes, energy, yes, there is an investment cost, but there are customers who are going to be paying for these energy additions. And then there are other opportunities that will be created, that will arise thanks to this green transition. Of course, we have to get to a position where we bring up the rest of the economy to this level and rise to the challenge. And of course, the banks must do so. We talked earlier about the matters of risk. As we try to get a better understanding of the risks and also of the opportunities, we will see that markets will be created thanks to better consideration for environmental issues. Well, yes, this is clearly something. The sooner we get out of the climate change cycle, the less costly it will be for everyone, even for our children who want to live in a healthy world and to be healthy themselves. Yes, everything depends on mobilizing the banks. The role of banks is to immediately give business money to that so they can immediately invest it and then stretch this out over time the way that it is reimbursed, and so to allow everyone to get on board with this transition as quickly as possible, even though it is a transition that is going to take time. And so I completely agree with Monique. Banks must get on board as this tool in order to help their customers. I think financing is just one of the pillars. I think the first thing we have to do is to actually listen. We must listen to our customers. We must listen to our stakeholders. This is the strength that we have in a relationship-based model, an interpersonal model. We are in the territories with individual clients, with private individuals, with NGOs, with corporates, businesses, small and large alike. We need to understand their needs, and this is our role. Secondly, once we've listened to them, we must enlighten our customers. We must tell them about where they are in relation to the overall sector, what the trajectory looks like. Is this a viable one? Are they on the right path? Have they started down it, or are they very far from their goals? That is the second contribution that banking can make. And then thirdly, financing. This is, of course, essential. We are very, very committed to this because we have an extremely important role in terms of ensuring this transition actually takes place and is successful. These huge figures, 330, 350 350 billion euros per year. These are European Central Bank figures, 350 billion. A quick rule of thumb, actually, in the last 10 years, the increase in balance sheets of banks in terms of the environment, we have financed roughly 500 billion in Europe additionally. So if we have 500 billion, that doesn't come from business as usual, as Fabrice was saying, but this is on top of, this comes in replacement of things that are absolutely urgent, that have to be replaced. Well, this is a matter of urgency. Everyone has to get on board with this, and we have to move very quickly. We're extremely committed to moving quickly here. Excellent. Well, right, before we get back to the Secretary of State from the German Chancellery, I would like to come back to what you said, Monique Barbut. There are major groups. Sorry, Carine. There are big companies. There are small companies. You have a background in entrepreneurship with Veolia before coming to Carrefour. So do we have time? Are we really falling so far behind in France in terms of the energy transition? But Madame Barbut, well, where are we? How are we doing in France? This is a major importance. Carrefour is not alone. We are part of an ecosystem. We have suppliers. We have partners. We have a whole set of tools. We have lots of different people and entities around us. We have created 20 megatons. The objective being to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 20 megatons. So that's for major distribution companies like ours. But can you impose this transition on your suppliers? Well, as I was saying, Carrefour is not alone. We're working with the SMEs who are suppliers. We also have a stream who have a special label, and these are green. I'm sure you're familiar with this. These are ecology, agroeconomic labels, and so we're able to bring people over to these greener methods of food production. So if we don't push and go for CSR, that's all very well and good to do that, but society must be behind it as well. I think everybody, as we were saying earlier, we can also create value. There are so many examples that we have where actually CSR, when it's implemented properly, really creates value, and that really changes things in terms of bringing society and people along with you. People are really happy with that, and I don't want to go on for this too long. But you said, Monique Barbut, there is an ecosystem that has its own value. There's a big group like Carrefour, and actually what they can do is they can bring their suppliers along with them. Fabrice, Monique Barbut, are you convinced by this approach? Well, this approach does seem very appealing when described like that. I, perhaps in a previous life, have also seen a number of perhaps unforeseen negative impacts of this. For instance, companies that take very strong steps in this direction and who force certain conditions on their suppliers. I'm thinking perhaps of suppliers in developing countries who are simply not able to keep up with these kinds of rules. And so both of these things together, if we are imposing these kinds of rules or requirements on suppliers, the company must follow through, which means they have to accompany people and support their suppliers through this transition, rather than simply excluding from the ecosystem or from their market because they're not able to keep up. I saw this a lot in my previous career in countries of the global south, and this is really something that we must be extremely vigilant about, and I am sure that many NGOs will be keeping a very, very close eye on how this runs, because we should we certainly do not want to see eviction of our economic fabric.
Fabrice Le Saché, oui.
Fabrice Le Saché, will come back to you, Jörg Kukies, in a minute. But Fabrice, telling your consumers, your customers, look, I'm greening my production, but not going to check really what's happening in the places that were used to be called lesser developed countries. If you don't go there and check and see really what's going on, I mean, what does it really mean? Is this really ecological? I'm really not very good at classifying different companies.
Because we realize that some SMEs have 100% transitional business models and other budding companies that popped up 2 years ago. So I don't think we should focus on the size of the company. But there is a reality, and this is what's really important to me in this panel, the ability, companies' ability to sponge in some financing and have available money with banks. And I'm really sorry for being overly focused on this. Now, a lot of managers have this will of focusing on decarbonization measures, and they consider this as a breeding ground for enhanced opportunities. 60% of available technologies to reach carbon neutrality, according to McKinsey, exist, but the business plan is not really up to snuff. And part of the business model is massification. We have to increase our scale and financing. Once again, I'm hammering this home. In our country, if we need colossal financing, public schemes, and so on and so forth, no. I mean, they might be useful because in major ArcelorMittal, Dunkirk places, 400 million are actually supported with the subsidies. Let's put it this way. So as to electrify high furnaces, and we know where major mission centers are located in France, and some work is done here, but the banking sector, which really has the ability to do so, but for that purpose, there has to be standards in Europe, because this is high time. We need to do this now, June and November, according to my figures. 40 to 50 billion euros for the transplantation of Basel III as done today. With the leverage effect, let's not forget about it. If you consider this 7 to 8 times, this is colossal on a European level. And you were also 70 billion. Okay. Anyway, this has an impact on cash invested by companies to finance ecological transition in France. In France, I mean, this is the situation with the leverage effect. So we're not really talking about, this is no cinch. I mean, this is not trivial. We're talking about a colossal thing. So diligence and reporting are necessary, and I'm sure that turning SMEs into administrative bodies, well, qualitative studies were made because they need to hire auditors and carry out carbon studies and fill out questionnaires and do reporting. Now, you're talking about major groups and SMEs. There's a genuine difference with human capacity and the standardization of data. And all this comes with a price tag, a heavy price tag. With SMEs, we had made the proposal in the COVID crisis, a green public mechanism, but we need easily identified SME mechanisms targeted on those very specific issues, and there is a will in this dimension, but we need to have access to the financing. Jörg, State Secretary of the German Chancellery, I hope you're still with us. Thank you very much for being with us. I wanted to ask you two questions, Mr. Secretary of State. The first one, with all those regulations and how is financing possible? We're talking about heavy investments, heavy investments in ecological and digital transitions. And Mr. Secretary of State, now, despite the German's budgetary situation, how do you foresee this combination between banks and the public sector?
Yes, we are of course looking very carefully at some of the regulation changes that will affect the potential investors into the transition of our economy, namely banks and insurance companies. In both, we are following the Basel III and Solvency II discussions very, very closely. There was an initiative when I was still in the finance ministry between the German and French finance ministry on Basel III. I think that was, and to a large extent, taken on board by the Commission in its legislative proposals. So what we are hearing from banks, asset managers, insurance companies, and pension funds, that they are very keen to engage with us in investing into the renewable transition of our economy. The topic of ESG is very popular among investors, and certainly what we are doing with renewable energies goes directly into that direction. The EU taxonomy has been very clear that the only truly green sources of energy are the renewables. So in that sense, that's an area where regulation is actually helping. We are still pushing in the context of the Green Deal that, for example, on the international projects of common European interest, the green hydrogen is promoted even more in all of the competition law things. We need to take into account that in some areas of alternative production, especially storage, the economic viability is not yet reached. So we have to find a model similar to what we've all achieved in wind, where initially the government has to provide subsidies, but those melt down. And as we're seeing in some wind projects that we saw live in action in the Danish North Sea yesterday, actually no subsidies are required anymore, and the private sector finances those completely autonomously without any kind of state aid. For hydrogen, we're not there yet, and we are relying on the Commission to be very fast in setting the framework to promote hydrogen investments, especially into green hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. Étienne Barel,
with regards to the financing of ecological and digital transitions banks, French banks, do they have the right weapons? Are they well positioned and braced for this, despite the various regulations? Are going to be up to snuff? They're going to outperform their duties. French banks want to be the leaders. They want to position themselves as leading stakeholders in this transitional process, and I believe they are. And we are going to be talking about the interaction with regulations, but the mindset is to be a leader. Why? Because, as already described, the French ecosystem is such that leadership is important in this transitional process, and we need to support this by being at this position already. And we can actually provide some evidence, and the evidence is very simple. French banks were the first ones to exit some of the sectors which were not part of that transitional sector. They decided to exit the carbon financing sector. And they said several years ago that they would no longer finance any thermal carbon mining and processing. And year after year, evaluations are being made because engagements need to be made. How much money is being left in those portfolios? 2.5 billion 5 years, or 1.2 billion 2 years ago. We'll see this year very low amounts, and we'll reach 0.0. And then what type of additional energy will be put on the table? An energy that will be part of that transitional process. The greenest, for example, renewable energies. What's the situation today? Secretary of State's Kukies talked about it. We are in the leading position in Europe and France insofar as the financing of renewable energies, regardless of where you're talking in Europe. We're no longer about 2 billion, 40 billion per annum financed by French banks, and this is not going down. It's actually rapidly going up, between 15 to 20% increase per annum. Now, I believe that this is a very important leading position. Forgive me, but I was just thinking of ex post facto. we're talking about renewable energies and photovoltaic energies and wind, but by definition, those techniques are imported. Those are things we buy. Photovoltaics will are bought. Panels come from China. The Secretary of State talked about the wind energy because this comes from Germany. But this also increases the trade balance deficit. Now, you as a banker, of course, being a leader in those renewable energies, but at the same time, bear in mind that in some way or another, because right now we do not have those techniques in France, bear in mind that this is a problem to the French economy. Our role is, we've got a dual cap here. Number one, we need to help companies, French companies and European companies, to be stronger and more competitive. And this is quite essential to just to be able to really benefit from that important industrial base.
Je crois que c'est important de la compétitivité.
This is an important component of competitiveness. In other words, cost, the quantitative aspects, the financing aspects are important, and this is quite paramount. And we need to provide this because regulations should help us being provided with those components. We need to be agnostic as well as to where things come from and make sure that this transition is materialized. And there's an important triangle here between banks on the one hand, clients on the other, and public authorities. And the role of public authorities is extremely important in this transition. And that's why I'd like to see this opportunity and talk about this. This triangle has to be up and running, and each one should actually be up to scratch here. And public authorities have a political mandate, for example, and they need to shed light on the various choices and perhaps dictate the standard and decide what is allowed and not allowed. And banks need to challenge our clients, if not public authorities, but we cannot just be set aside. And so far as the ecological transition, I'm sorry, I'll get back to this, and with the same type of question I asked Étienne Barel, renewable energy is great. Less CO2, okay, so much the better. Decarbonization, so much the better. Okay, this is the perfect world in the greatest of all worlds. But those techniques are being imported, so we're also destroying some jobs before we create jobs with this ecological transition. Yes or no? Well, it's not that accurate statement, and I remember that some years back, France, for example, and so forth, photovoltaic sectors had quite a number of companies. Ahead of the game, but the Minitel was also created, if you remember. Yes. So what I mean here is that, once again, this is an opportunity. So investments and jobs that are going to be destroyed, but other jobs are going to be created. Absolutely. You were referring to wind, for example. I think, well, I think of the German companies with a French technology, Vernier, for example. So this also exists. What does that mean? Well, that means that we're going to be putting more money on those types of companies today than was done in the past. And as an aside, the nuclear sector was some type of an eviction of all those energy utilities. Well, that's a way of seeing things. Eviction or independence, perhaps. Okay, but
Pourquoi n'y a-t-il
pas
d'énergie? Parce que l'énergie a tout blasté, enfin si j'ose dire.
Well, because the energy blasted it all that and stymied the development of other types of energies. Fabrice, you don't agree with us. I'm not finished. I'm sorry. I also wanted to, now with respect to banks, I wanted to make the following point. True.
Dans notre analyse.
The way we see things in the aftermath of the Paris agreements, Paris was holding a leading position on a worldwide basis in quite a number of things. I'm also taking note of the fact that all the French banks joined the Net Zero Alliance, Net Zero Banking Alliance, and the Glasgow contraption, Neutral Financial Alliance. Okay. Which means no financing by the year 2050. I'm talking about the financing of fossil energy sources. Now, let me just say, well, I'd like to take this opportunity. This is very important. Forgive me. Okay, in a nutshell. Just to say that you got the rules, but you also have banks, forceful initiatives, and corporate initiatives, and they're important because they're worldwide, international. The Net Zero Banking Alliance is now, we're talking about dozens of banks, not far from 100 banks in the world that are engaged to be neutral by 2050. But neutral by 2050 is not just neutral by 2050, but what we're going to be doing in 2025, what we're going to be doing in 2030, and what are you going to be doing right now just to reach that position? This is important.
Tout ça, c'est juste.
Okay, this is good, right? It has to be
remarqué et
acknowledged. And
effectivement, bien de voir des engagements.
It's all very nice to see initiatives, such great initiatives, but we're really taking note of the fact that today banks are indicating, but we have no common methodology. We don't really know exactly how they all do their calculus, and this could be calculated very differently from one place to another. Number two, we're also taking note of the fact that despite all this,
le financement des énergies fossiles,
the financing of fossil energies, okay, on a worldwide basis, let's take that into consideration. 4 of the most important French banks are among the 30 greatest financial institutions of fossil energy since the Paris Agreement, and have been so since the Paris Agreement. Okay, on the one hand, you no longer have any carbon, you don't finance carbon, but this does not mean that all of the fossil energies have been phased out or out of this financial scheme. And we're now expecting this from banks. We're expecting a more important engagement in this sector. And we're also expecting banks to
qu'il n'y ait pas simplement, si vous voulez, que la question
not just focus on the financing of energy sources, but also other types of business activities. The cement industry, the steel industry, the automotive industry, and
avoir des engagements.
We'd like to get engagements and
c'est clair. Étienne Barel, peut-être un mot sur
pathways. Étienne Barel, perhaps a few words. Two very important components need to be mentioned. Methodology is one of them, and the business sector is the other component beyond energy, outside of the energy, and both are connected with one another. And banks need to play a very important role in those, so far as methodology is concerned. As a company today, you're not going to be trading up and tell your bank, oh, I calculated my turnover using this methodology because this is how I do things, and the other is going to be turning up, okay, I'm going to be calculating it this other way. You only have one single methodology, one single set of data, and it works very well. We need to reach the same thing insofar as the extra financial items. And we're working with all the banks in common just to define which methodology we're going to be picking out for photovoltaic and how CO2
entraîne des missions.
How much emission it generates and the trajectory. In other words,
pour dire que c'est le réveil et qu'il n'y a plus beaucoup.
Oh, so this is the alarm clock. Which tells me they have very little time before carbon neutrality. So this trajectory, just to make a long story short, it's very important to have the same starting data, the same indicators, and the most emissive sectors, emission generating sectors. And with the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we should define those most emission generating sectors, and companies should stick to the trajectories as to really reach that carbon neutrality. Cement, the construction industry, the automotive, mobility sector, energy. All this is covered. All those are covered, and it's very important to really focus on homogeneous data and have banks there to really support us in dealing with them the same way. Got a few minutes. Let's talk about digital transition, because we've been talking about ecological transition. Now, this is very important, of course, but digital transition, I mean, there are quite a number of people are engaged in this. Carine, at Carrefour, for example, you were referring to 300,000 employees worldwide, right?
Oui, monde. qui sont
that are quite aware and trained in this respect in terms of digital transition. Are those external training schemes, awareness method campaigns? Well, they're going to be taking place very soon. And just to get back to green finance and green transition, digital can really help us out quite tremendously with the blockchain. We're trying to identify our raw materials. For example, if you buy organic cotton at Carrefour, you can scan and see where it was produced. So we consider this as a green revolution, as a highly central matter within the company. And let me get back. I'm sorry, I'm shying away from the digital dimension, but with the ecosystem, we don't really consider this. I mean, we don't realize how much it is favorable to the ecosystem. We talked about public authorities, and the package law was no cinch. Not a lot of European countries or other countries scratch their heads about the use of a company and the fundamental purpose. We also have quite a number of corporates like Carrefour and others. L'Oréal is another one. Really, they're braced for battle. And I'm a former Veolia person. And those people supporting us at Veolia and Suez were the two champions in terms of ecological transition. Well, there are only one now, Bill. You have the new Suez, but ours is a rare ecosystem with so many people thinking about the green transition with the ups and downs, of course. Things are not moving fast enough, but this is something that has to be underscored. MEDEF, digital transition. I'd like to get back to the nuclear dimension here, but there is a link with digital transition. There is a link because 5G, which is now being deployed, now on that platform. Yesterday, we had a general from cybersecurity general said that there were 4,000 to 5,000 interactions per day with connected objects and our watches and our telephones, and all this is generating a colossal demand consumption demand. I'm getting back to the nuclear dimension because this is quite relevant. It's quite a pivotal dimension. And in June, an act is going to go through Parliament. I think it can be said there is a battle so as to integrate the nuclear energy in the taxonomy. This is a methodological issue. If you want to be successful in decarbonization, you cannot be ideological. You have to choose the best technology, available technologies. And I cannot let people say that the nuclear sector is something which we invested a lot in. There was sub-investments, chronic sub-investments took place in France. So we decided to reinvest, which we supported quite strongly. Why? Because expertise was being lost in France. Let me just remind you that 200,000 industrial jobs in the nuclear dimension. I was referring to Dunkirk. We're not going to be electrifying high furnaces with wind energies in the company. We're also having offshore wind parks. That's very nice. But what happens when you close down nuclear power plants? We've got the German example right next door. The CO2 emission factor in France is 10 times less important than in Germany. 10 times less important than in Germany. But the waste reprocessing now. We're talking about decarbonization. Yes, you're right. But we need to talk about the objective, which is the emergency. But Dominique Barbus, perhaps by developing a high-quality nuclear park, we shouldn't actually put the hair on our chest with. In France, perhaps we sub-invested, underinvested. I was saying we were importing photovoltaic energy sources. We're importing wind. We're not really that great so far as ocean energy. Perhaps we underestimated the necessary investments in those renewable energies, contrary to Germans that embraced those quite early on. But they increased their CO2 emission levels. Okay, I'm just going to take 1 minute. We're actually shifting from one dependence to the other where we pace things up so much. We're not against renewable energies, but we open ourselves to gas and we see the results there. So we need to leave each one of the country follow their own trajectory. Okay, let's actually put this ecological transition to a halt. But you were talking about digital transition. Just a few words because we're talking about digital deserts. In France, it's nice to talk about digital transitions, 125 billion euros per annum in Europe. This is to guarantee this digital transition, but let's also talk about our country here. You're talking, they're the head of WWF, France. Okay, as far as we're concerned, this is really paramount. That digital revolution, transition, is paramount. Why? Because
pour parler aussi de transition écologique, et moi je
We can talk about ecological transition and not just talking about
je dirais énergétique.
energy
Il y a
transition.
un certain nombre d'autres secteurs qui
So
sont
other sectors are in the loop here,
des données.
are in the radar screen, and data are important, and they play an important role
Par
here.
exemple, aux questions
I'm thinking of deforestation.
bientôt, normalement, un acte européen.
And a European bill is going to be issued very soon insofar as imported deforestation.
Clairement,
And obviously,
comment peut-on suivre ce
how can we follow this kind of
Nous
process
n'avons pas
if
des données
we don't have without reliable satellite-based data,
et digitalisées
digitalized data,
pour que justement chacun ait bien
for each and everyone to be aware
entendu, si
of
vous voulez, des terres qu'on veut
the scope of those
d'importation,
lands that need to be frozen, the import business, to identify frauds and try to
vous voulez,
analyze all those data.
Quelque part,
In some ways, if
intégrer de
our
façon
objective is to drill down,
en particulier les
integrate environmental issues and biodiversity-related issues in a refined way, and integrate those in the studies that we are going to be performing. Those are going to have to be associated with a digital revolution and digital economy. Just a few words on data. Fabrice, this is an issue.
À répondre à la question. Mais parce que la question des données,
Now,
ça intéresse.
data, this is of interest to companies in MEDEF.
Données que ce soit
Data, digital ecological transitional data, this is a genuine issue, yes, because data can be commoditized. There's a regulation attached to them. We use data to get a better knowledge of our customers and sell products and services, but this is a general statement which I'm putting forward now. And so far as data are concerned, we need to really talk about dosage balance. We understand we need to protect consumers and personal data, but with artificial intelligence, and some countries are really well into it, but we don't want to have as few regulations as they do, but we need to have important data, important volumes of data, be able to process data, and try to really strike out a balance between flexibility and regulations.
C'est aussi des questions d'éthique.
So, and how about ethical matters? Yes, ethical matters are important, and in France we have governmental or national agencies, and sometimes things are complicated. And a very specific example with the COVID crisis, one of the proposals we had made was to send text messages via private telephone companies, and this was impossible because we were told, okay, data protection complexity, whereas we're really living a very complex period, and this action for the uploading of the anti-COVID application was just common sense. So there's a tension between regulations and the will to really make rapid headway. Monsieur Barel, just a few words on data and how banks approach this matter. I believe that banks are now approaching this as being an essential challenge just to really foster good dialogues with their customers. Let me get back to the situation in the financial sector when banks need, or for example, if they need to make a decision on a credit to identify their customers' health level, the financial data exchange is quite flawless, and another pathway is not that flawless, and clients, corporate clients are quite familiar with this.
Know your customer, KYC.
The KYC, know your customer process, which is somewhat complicated because we haven't really standardized and well-defined this, and banks are asking for the same thing 4 times, depending on the format, and I'm sure that Fabrice or Carine know what I'm talking about. We should not be trapped into this. With an immediate emergency, we're going to be trying to solve this right away. We often forget about the urbanization, the process, the industrialization process, which is quite crucial because tomorrow we will need the extra financial data as well as we need financial data, and as a result we'll need to define the way for clients. It's going to be very simple, very flawless, and for banks we'll be able to really support them as best we can. To conclude the panel, I'd like to get back to Mr. Kukies, who's live with us. Mr. Secretary of State, just one question. You were saying that Germany had embraced, Germany had embraced new renewable energies very, very early, so you've been ahead of the game. Is that good or bad for Germany to embrace the Grünen, the green energy.
Là, on vous entend pas, donc la réponse.
We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez, monsieur?
Can you hear me?
Est-ce que vous pouvez reprendre?
Mr. Secretary of State, can you actually reiterate? Thank you very much.
Je vais recommencer.
Okay, I'll repeat.
So I don't think renewable energy has a party color. It is green, yes. So we're happy that this is now being built out, and it's built out in great consensus, by the way, in all political parties in Germany, with one exception on the extreme right. So in that sense, I think it's something that also our industry completely supports. There's a 230-page study by the German equivalent of MEDEF, the German Federation of Industry, which also traces that the public sector and the private sector are going in lockstep on these issues. So I think it's something that has a broad consensus. I just wanted to say one word on digital very quickly, because I do think this is a great project of common interest between Germany and France. Commissioner Breton has launched the CHIPS Act. It's extremely important in semiconductors that we digitize. It's an extremely enormously important strategic asset. We're very happy that Intel is investing $33 billion just 1 month after the CHIPS Act was launched, and the vast bulk of that is going to Germany and France. So this is an element of the digitization, in addition to everything we're doing in startups together. I think it's also worth mentioning that Economics Minister Bruno Le Maire and German Finance Minister Christian Lindner signed an agreement that we will work very closely together to promote startups in general and fintechs in particular. So, l'amitié franco-allemande fonctionne au secteur.
The French-German friendship is definitely working in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Secretary of State. Thank you to all of our panelists. We are going to move to the final discussion of today's conference.